Right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this online event entitled Charting a Hopeful Path to Centering Women-Led Organizations in Humanitarian Response. Um, my name is Dr. Megan Degg, and I'm a Senior Research Fellow and Gender Lead for the Humanitarian Policy Group based at ODI Global in London. And we're here today to launch our new paper, Pathways Towards Better Funding for Women-Led Organizations, which you can find online. I think we'll also hopefully have a link shared in the chat. This paper is co-authored by me as well as my colleagues Katerina Matsili and Nick Virapin, who are both here on the call. And it's the culmination of a year-long research project that we've been doing um, based on a desk review of existing literature, on 2 online stakeholder consultations, a survey that we did with 271 women-led organizations, and dozens of interviews. In this work, we're highlighting that women-led organizations, or WLOs, you're going to hear us saying both, are indispensable humanitarian actors whose proximity, trust, and gendered analysis enable them to reach people and fulfill priorities that other actors just can't. And I want to be clear that this is much more than a technical exercise about funding mechanisms. It speaks to systemic issues around leadership, ownership, and decision-making power in humanitarian response. And these are key concerns that are shaping efforts to move towards more locally led action. It also speaks to inertia and the difficulty of achieving change. Over the course of our research, we've encountered lots of allies and lots of people who support the work we're doing and the work that WLOs are doing, but many feel like change is impossible or too hard to make a reality. So in this paper and here in this event, we're focusing on the interventions that are working and demonstrating that different is possible. As Gloria from the Irene M. Stalin Foundation said to me recently, does this make these things innovations if they're working, or does it make them just good? So I'll leave that to you to consider as we proceed. I'm going to walk us through our agenda, um, and and then we're going to jump in with our speakers. So first, we're going to hear from Rurik from the UK government, which has supported this research project throughout its lifetime. Then we've got a panel of lightning talks lined up. Each speaker is going to talk about how they're working to carve out more space, more flexibility, and better networks for women-led humanitarian action. Some of these speakers are featured in our paper, but some aren't, and that's because we're seeking to highlight the variety of efforts that are already happening and that funders can support. After that, my colleague Katerina and I will share some overarching findings from our research, which you can also find online. And finally, we'll have time for an open discussion of the research and what more we can all do to facilitate women-led responses. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Rurik Marsden, a Deputy Director of Humanitarian Policy and Partnerships with the UK's Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, or FCDO. Rurik, are you with us?
Hi, yes. Sorry, I'm struggling with my phone and my computer, so I might find it a bit difficult to kind of stay properly on screen. But anyway, I'm so excited to be here today. Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak. And I just want to start by saying we really appreciate the joint effort that's gone into this report, all of the collaborators who contributed to building up this important piece of thinking. And I think the report sets out really clearly why it's right that we should be having this conversation and we should be focusing on WLOs. There's a just one bit I wanted to quote. WLOs are indispensable actors whose proximity, trust, and gendered analysis enable them to reach people and advance priorities that international actors often cannot, while frequently doing so more cost effectively. And I think that that really captures it. And I was in South Sudan last month or beginning of this month, and I was able to talk to several women-led organizations, and in an incredibly challenging context, it was so inspiring to learn about their work, and they were really some of the most creative, the most impactful, the most strategic organizations that I had the chance to talk to during my visit. And the way they were working was simply superb. And that sort of picks many of these reasons that make women-led organizations so important in how we think about humanitarian response. They reach people that others can't. They can often deliver more efficiently. They they design their priorities with affected communities and particularly marginalized groups, kind of right at the heart of the thinking. Um, they strengthen accountability and safeguarding. They don't think in the silos that we sometimes think. They don't separate peace and conflict and humanitarian and development and climate. They think, with the needs of the community, and they stay and deliver when others can't. So our common objectives need to be to shift power, to shift money, and to shift our processes, um, to make sure that we are putting the right focus and emphasis and funding on WLOs. So shifting the power, I mean moving to a model that works in genuine partnership, whether that's with governments or with local actors, including WLOs. And I mean creating genuine platforms for local leadership and decision making. By shifting the money, I mean ensuring that quality funding is really reaching local actors and that they're not falling through the cracks of the sort of existing humanitarian system. And by shifting process, I mean ensuring that local actors get to design interventions and hold international actors accountable, not the opposite. And really ensuring that funding processes work, that we're improving quality and reducing bureaucratic burdens. So just to ask ourselves, kind of how are we doing? I want to go back to those women-led organisations I met in South Sudan. They were able to use the deep trust they had with communities to work in novel and very impactful ways, including on really, really sensitive issues. But were they getting trust from the intermediaries that we were using to channel funds to them? And the sad reality is that they were getting short-term funding that was tightly managed and was tightly controlled. And I asked them, like, would you change your approach? Would you be doing things differently if you had more control over the money? You could design the program differently. And they literally laughed at me. And they explained a set of ways in which they could have much more impact if they were given more control and more predictable funding. And I think, so there's no doubt it's good that we were supporting them, but we have to take things to another level, and we have to make sure that we've got really kind of equitable partnerships. So there are three things I just want to say in conclusion about things that we probably, or we definitely need to do differently as the donors, but also the broader international system. First, we need to set up our systems and our intermediaries to get better support to grassroots organisations with equitable partnerships. We need to identify and implement best practice through our guidance, through better communities of practice, and through including local voices and women-led organisations in the way that we understand and improve our key systems like risk and due diligence and make them fit for purpose. We need to promote equitable, predictable multi-year funding, and we need to improve the suitability of pooled funds, which could be a critical mechanism to ensure that they're really working for local partners. Second, we need to support tailored mechanisms, and I think that the First Response Fund is a really good example. So back in 2024, the UK hosted a Wilton Park discussion on improving resourcing. I'm pretty sure that many of the people who are in this discussion were there, part of that conversation. And actually, the First Response Fund really, I think, has risen to that challenge. And I think it is a mechanism for getting inclusive and locally led humanitarian action funding. And it's channeling rapid, flexible funding through an expanding network. But we need to do that in more places using more mechanisms. And third, I think we need to build consensus and understanding of these issues and make sure that it's consistently one of those key things we're thinking about. And we need to use our opportunities, like the broader work we're doing on humanitarian and multilateral reform, our upcoming global partnership conference. We need to make sure that we are doing our best to send consistent messages and creating platforms for the full range of locally kind of led initiatives, but particularly women-led organisations, and ensure that we're really reaching our teams through, with consistent messaging. So I hope that's a kind of a useful starting point. We really care about this. We think it's really important, and we're on a journey, and we know that we need to. There are things that we need to do differently, and I think that's probably true for the broader system. I'm sure there'll be a lot of useful ideas and suggestions in this conversation, and I look forward to hearing them and to engaging. Thanks, Oba.
Thanks so much, Rurik, for setting up this conversation so well in terms of how women-led organizations bring about those joined up and holistic approaches. And frankly, the need for that sense check on how the international community is doing on this work. I welcome your willingness to look in the mirror and be critical about that. And also harkening back to our conversations at Wilton Park 2 years ago now, and I'm really happy that today we can connect the dots and continue that conversation. And I'm going to start handing over to our panel of lightning speakers, hand over the virtual microphone now. And first, we have Ohaila Shamar, who is the Director General of the SAWA organization in Palestine. And Ohaila is going to share with us some of the programmatic work that SAWA is doing to meet needs in Palestine and ways they're working with funders to do that. Ohaila, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. In Palestine, people face overlapping challenges, ongoing displacement, restricted access to resource, and the daily struggle for safety and stability. And these reality women-led organizations have stepped in to fill critical gaps left by large institutions. They provided administrative and civil services that ease the bureaucratic burden to those in need, ensuring that help reach people faster and more fairly. This role mirrors the contribution of women-led organizations responding to emergencies across the world. These are not only services providers, but also trusted advocates and who bring humanity and efficiency to systems that can otherwise feel distant and hard to reach. Related to SAWA or women-led organization, often they are the first responder in time of crisis. For SAWA example, we have operated a psychological support helpline since 1998. More than 3 decades of continuous services establish and combat all forms of violence, abuse, and neglect against women and children. SAWA become a trusted lifeline for communities in crisis. Its helpline offer confidential, compassionate, and cultural sensitive counseling, provided providing 24/7 emergency support and referrals for issues going from domestic abuse and suicide ideation, alongside free counseling with doctor, lawyers, and speech therapy. Between October 2023 and March 2026 alone, SAWA received nearly 391,000 calls, answered over 245,000, and direct service more than 55,000 people, including over 20,000 women. These numbers reflect not just services, but lives touched and protected. This range of work shows how women-led organizations deliver immediate, professional, and holistic care, filling critical gaps that large institutions often cannot. Women-led organizations deep trust within their communities and trusted that is essential in time of crisis. Local groups like SAWA are relied upon exactly because they safeguard privacy and confidentiality, ensuring that survival of violence or trauma feel safe enough to reach out. SAWA innovations such as its Safe Chat platform demonstrated how women-led organizations use technology to overcome geographical barriers, making support accessible even when physical movement is restricted. But their role does not stop at immediate relief. SAWA not only respond to emergency, but also work detection to find the resources needed to keep its service running. Its reality. This has become more challenging as funding for Palestine has been reduced and some donors question their support. Despite these obstacles, SAWA continue to provide help whenever it is needed, drawing on the texts of experience and decades of experience and SAWA and deep community trust. It is not just about reducing harm today, it's about striving to shape a future where dignity, justice, and equality remain at the heart of the humanitarian response. Mandy, I try to describe what SAWA is doing in a very short time, but we do a lot of things more than what I try to pick the important service that we really support the community. And now we are in a risk that we don't know if we can continue our service or not because of funding crisis. Yeah.
Thank you, Ohila. And believe me, we recognize we've given you an impossible brief to try to summarize everything that you do in the time allotted. But thank you so much for sharing all of that. And I think it sets the foundation for everything that's to come and makes really clear the stakes of this debate about supporting WLOs and what we need to do. I'm going to turn now to Dr. Irene Dawa, who is the founder and technical advisor to Community Empowerment for Peace and Development, or CPAD in Uganda. And have we just lost Irene? I don't see her now. There, she's back. Okay. Irene is also the lead for the Feminist Humanitarian Network's Uganda National Platform. The Feminist Humanitarian Network has been a partner at many stages of our research, and they're doing really critical work and really important, innovative coordination work in Uganda. So we're going to hear from Irene on that.
Yes, thank you, Megan. Thank you for having me. First of all, CPAD is a member of the Feminist Humanitarian Network. And for those of you who do not know the Feminist Humanitarian Network, it's a network of global women-led and women rights organizations. 70% of its members come from the global south, and CPAD happens to be one of those members from the global south. We work together with the global network, and we were lucky as CPAD last year to secure funding with the global network from IMS. It's a Swedish.
I think we've lost Irene. Oh, I hope her connection's okay. Hopefully she can pop back in shortly. I want to hear so much more about that work. In the meantime, I've shared a link to the Feminist Humanitarian Network in the chat. So anyone who isn't aware of their work, please do check it out as a space you can support or at least to learn more about women-led action. And I see Irene is back with us, so we'll jump back in.
Sorry, I don't know why my network keeps going off. Maybe I'll put the video off to see if that helps. Yeah. Yeah, so CPAD, I was at the point of explaining how we got funding from IMS to fund local humanitarian-led women organizations in Uganda, a network of 32 women-led organizations that came together. We formed the first national platform of the Feminist Humanitarian Network. The objective of FHN Global is to at least fund several national platforms to raise funds for feminist women-led organizations in country, because FHN realizes and the work women-led organizations do, but also the gaps in funding they experience from time to time. So the 32 members of Uganda work collectively, not in silos. We implement the integrated program ranging from GBV, SRH, mental health. This was after we sat as a network to identify our key national priorities regionally. And based on that, we were able to know who is going to work where and supporting the communities. And these interventions are based on the needs of the community. Secondly, through the FHN, I must confess that CPAD has gotten visibility in platforms. If it was not through the FHN, I wouldn't be in this meeting today. I wouldn't even be part of the report that is being launched today, because I got to know Megan through the FHN. Since last year, I have been in Geneva 3 times having conversations at that level. Through this funding, I'm able to have direct conversations with donors, with with the other partners, which is something we never had an opportunity to do before. We had access to this kind of engagement. Last week, I was able to meet with FCDO.
I'm hoping she can come back again very quickly because we were really getting good there. Oh, here she is. Irene, are you with us? Oh, this is unfortunately the reality of convening across regions and time zones.
That is one
Irene,
of our classic challenges we have as
mm-hmm.
women-led organizations, because sometimes the kind of internet we have cannot just really support our work. My apologies for that. Yeah, so through this fund, through the FHN, we have been able to share resources as a network, not only the money as such, but also human resource. We have been able to identify the needs of each platform member, where they're located, and we're able to send pair members to be able to share their knowledge, support each other, support learning collectively. Our focus is that if we fail as a collective, and if we win collectively, because that's how we feel like as a network we can be able to meet the needs of our community. For example, if we identify a gap in one of our platform members, we send a technical person from another organization to go and sit and support them so that they're able to meet the needs of their communities as expected. Importantly, this fund has shifted power, power of decision making, to us as the local actors. It was us, the network, not even influenced by the global team members, us, the national platform members, who decided what do we want to do, where do we want to do, with whom do we want to do. There was no influence of, these are the outputs or the outcomes normally, which would come with the restricted funding, a project document outcome, and you don't know what. But in this project, we were able to decide what we wanted to do, because the project didn't come with prescribed activities. So the decision was entirely in our hands. And as we implement the project, by the way, from time to time, me as the project coordinator who listens to the platform members, who advises them, there are members who would come to me and they will be like, oh, our computer charger just blew off, so now we don't have access to the computer. And I'm like, okay, just assign some budget, go and buy another charger for your computer. But in most of the traditional donors, that will be a disallowed cost because it was not budgeted. But this is the reality in which women-led organizations operate. You have got to be as flexible as possible to allow them to respond. There are these simple things like transport, access to, like, the refugee, because our members have refugee-led organizations who are actually in the settlement. We have people who are in conflict with the law, with the Ugandan government. These are people you may have a different way of working with them. Their priorities are very different. So flexibility is on top of how we actually implementing these projects. Another important aspect is this is a project that has created a safe space for women-led organization. We are able to share, organize ourselves, and collectively challenge the systems around us. And it is also the first, network that has welcomed everybody. It has an open door. It is not restricted. As long as it's women-led and women-founded, we try to respond to everybody. But as a network, we also know that operating in a country like Uganda, it poses significant risk for us because of the people we work with. And as Haila said, we are always constantly, it is only one funding, like donor that has given us money. The money is not able to meet all the needs and of the community in which we serve. We are constantly struggling. Like for us, CPAD, last week we just heard that one of our, long-term funding through the ECHO is going to end next month. So what it means for CPAD, we are going to lose 22 staff, including members at the secretariat. So now I'm scratching my head, what next, because this fund was bound to end at some point. So we're just waking up like, okay, now what? Are we supposed to close our doors? If we close the doors, what happens to our community? So, but this funding has helped us. It has opened us ways. There are partners who have told us it is their first time to access funding, let alone the work they have been doing in their communities. We will be doing information sharing session in Kampala in early May, where the partners are coming to do outcome harvesting. And we will invite you'll come and listen to them, because I don't want to speak to them. I would want you to listen to what gains there, because I'm speaking as CPAD. I'm not speaking for all the networks. So these are just a few of the things that I can share from the experience in working with feminist funding and flexible funding so far. Thank you. Over to you, Megan.
Thank you, Irene, and thank you for sticking with it despite the connectivity issues. And frankly, this is exactly why WLOs need core funding for better infrastructure and connectivity and ability to be involved in conversations like this one. But I think so many of your comments also make clear how funding is absolutely key, but so is access to spaces, to decision making and coordination and inclusion in conversations and platforms and mechanisms, and building connections between individual WLOs and the sort of networks and people who can help give them the space they need. Um, so when we're thinking about getting resources into the hands of WLOs, I want to turn to someone who's involved in making that happen already, and that is Vinita, who is the co-lead of the Urgent Action Fund for Women's Human Rights Asia Pacific, to hear about what that looks like in practice and how it can be scaled and strengthened. Vinita?
Thanks so much. Thanks so much, Megan. It's good that you have already mentioned the word scale, because that is a prominent thing in what I can contribute to this conversation. So before I begin, the Urgent Action Funds are a unique infrastructure. We are a set of four autonomous funds. So Urgent Action Funds in Africa, Latin America, and Caribbean. Urgent Action Fund for Feminist Activism that's based in the US, but responds domestically in the US and to parts of West Asia, and Central Asia, Eastern Europe. And then there is us in Asia and the Pacific. And the Pacific is also strategic because we do recognize that there are two powerful, distinct regions that we belong to and respond to. So collectively, all the four of us Urgent Action Funds cover the entire globe. And we have rapidly been responding to crises for over 25 years. The first UAF was birthed in the heels of the Bosnian War. This is something that's relevant even today. And we continue to support women, gender non-binary, trans-led groups and organizations across a variety of crises, both in terms of how we understand in the mainstream, so whether that's humanitarian conflict, natural disasters, but also when each of these leaders face a risk or want to capitalize on an opportunity themselves to advance their mission. To date, we have moved more than about 75 million directly into the hands of women, girls, gender non-binary, trans-led groups and organizations globally, and that's roughly through about 15,000 grants. The word urgent and the word action are in our name, and rapid appears before our grant making. So we are a rapid response grant maker. So you get the drift. But the model or the urgent action funds were birthed directly as a response that human rights defenders all over the world powerfully articulated, and those especially from the global south, that there needs to be a resourcing architecture that responds to crisis. And one that is hyper local, one that is decolonial, one that cuts through bureaucracy, and one that is approachable for people across varied contexts. And like I said, especially in the larger majority world. So this we practice every day. If you think of scale, we receive applications and we disburse grants every day. So roughly at Asia and Pacific, which is where I come from, my team of about 5 or 6 grants facilitators field about 40 applications a month. Last year alone, from January to December 2025, we dispersed close to 600 grants. That's more than the number of working days in that year. And each of these disbursements also need to really factor in contexts that are, with heightened security issues in many of the countries, especially in the Asian context. So that also means that the disbursement of funds needs to happen safely and securely, especially for those who receive it, because the risk of receiving foreign money is greater than the risk of disbursing foreign money. So if you are, let's say, in the Philippines today and you're receiving money from outside of Philippines, you will go through a series of regulations. You will have to, follow a set of very stringent legal frameworks, and that is something that we fully respect. But that also means that each of these disbursements, that are several in a day, need to go through several hoops. The fact that we are rapid does not mean we dilute deep due diligence. So there are a host of due diligence measures that help us with with abiding by several measures, let's say, such as the FCDO or many other bilateral groups have in place to ensure that the money is going into the right hands. This all of this is very valuable across many crises, but in the context of this conversation on humanitarian crises. So last year alone, or end of 2024, we responded to the earthquake in Vanuatu. One of my colleagues who was at the front of that response is in the webinar today. Then there was an earthquake in Myanmar, floods in Pakistan. There was an earthquake in Afghanistan, cyclones in Fiji, Indonesia, Sri Lanka, Philippines. And the last four happened like within 60 days, right? Like that was the last quarter of 2025. And this, like our decades of experience of responding to many crises has been valuable in responding to these humanitarian crises, right? So we have across the globe, all UAFs collectively have about 700 advisors who do not wait for crises to come. So you're looking at an early warning system at scale. And when a natural disaster, there's a sudden onset of a natural disaster, the first thing is to get in touch with the advisors, is to get in touch with grantees on the ground. In most cases, these grantees, all of whom are women-led organizations or those led by gender non-binary trans people, are already responding to the disaster that they are facing themselves. So it's imperative for money to reach their hands directly, and we try to do that within 5 to 7 working days. So our first grant after the earthquake in Vanuatu or the cyclone in Philippines reached within 7 working days of the cyclone hitting the coastal Philippines. And response is then intersectional. It reaches out to most vulnerable populations. This is something that both you and your colleagues have written quite eloquently in the paper, and Rurik has also, mentioned it quite directly as evidence to the work that feminist funds do. And contrary to mainstream notions of what humanitarian crisis is, which is always understood as a sudden onset, right? So it's important to resource as crises hit the longer arc. And as even our attention span shifts, right? So the attention span right now, for example, is not on Afghanistan. It never is to any country in the Pacific, any of the islands in the Pacific. So the first thing to do is to respond to the crisis, but to also influence attention spans all across the world and on the geopolitics of, therefore, what gets resourced. And that is very much, front and center of the work that we do. When we respond to prolonged crisis, we support a whole network, especially of women's rights organizations on the ground, that then become the sort of safety net when a crisis hits, right? So it's very important to sustain and support those larger networks, organizations, all of which, Irene and Ohaila have mentioned as people who are, first responders in their own context. So I will not repeat. But this work and these examples add color and are testament to all the evidence that Megan, you and your team have put together in the paper. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Benita. I think hearing from you about what mechanisms like the Urgent Action Sister Funds are already doing to break down barriers, to get funding out there efficiently and effectively. This is experience that should be instructive for all kinds of funders seeking to make an impact in crises, that they can learn from it and also that they can support it. And also how the feminist funds understand crises, I mean, as they really are in people's lives. They're multifaceted. They have deep roots in social and economic and political structures, and they're really complex. So I think thinking about how our funding can be tailored to suit the purpose is really helpful here. And so I'm going to turn to our last lightning speaker, Sarah Red, the Advocacy and Campaigns and Engagement Manager for Oxfam's Ukraine response, to share with us some of Oxfam's efforts to be a better partner and to be a better intermediary for women-led organizations. Sarah, go ahead.
Thank you, Megan. It's difficult going last and having to follow all of that impressive work that's been talked about so far. So here I go. I'll give it a try. So I'll talk a little bit today about something called the Women's Humanitarian Leadership Fund that we've done in Ukraine. So we developed, Oxfam and ActionAid jointly developed the Women's Humanitarian Leadership Fund to support women's rights organizations in Ukraine at the time of acute crisis. And I'll say now, to kind of caveat, we specifically worked with women's rights organizations. And it's a contextual reason for that. In Ukraine, the majority of NGOs are women-led because of the war. But it doesn't necessarily mean that they're working on gender equality. So we really wanted to make sure that we were targeting organizations that were working on gender equality. And at its core, the fund it provides small, flexible grants directly to women's rights organisations. So in the first phase, it was about €24,000, and in this recent phase that we're doing right now, it's around €15,000. So it's small pots of money, but it's flexible. The intention is for it to be fully flexible and to designed in a way that allows women's rights organisations to respond to the realities that they're facing, rather than based on a predefined project framework. And the aim isn't necessarily just to fund activities, but it's also to support the sustainability of the organizations themselves during crisis. What really defined the Women's Humanitarian Leadership Fund, I think, is not just what we did, but how we did it, and choosing to work differently, and trying to think about how we move from our commitments on localization and inclusion to actually changing how the system works in practice to support women's rights organizations. I think actually the timing of this event is critical, because we are at a moment when we are demonstrating why it is so necessary to work with women's rights organizations in crisis. We are seeing a global rollback on rights. We are seeing the introduction of the extended global gag rule with US funding. We have a humanitarian reset that is pushing us to think about priorities and efficiencies. But as I think the report that you've developed, Megan, highlights, that meaningful change requires more than just technical tweaks. It requires us to shift how we collaborate, how we take risks, and designing funding models. So I'm just going to talk about 3 ways in which we try to do things differently with this fund. The first is that we worked very differently with the funder from the very beginning. The initial phase was funded by the Disasters Emergency Committee in the UK, sorry. When we were developing the proposal with DEC, we didn't treat the compliance as fixed. We treated it as something that could be designed differently. And we changed the value proposition to the funder. It was about investment in women's rights organization, in learning, and in impact of the mechanism, rather than output focused. So, for example, the reporting for us to DEC was focused around learning, not auditing women's rights activities. The accountability was approached differently to avoid downstream control. So in practice, the financial reporting was based on the transfer to women's rights organizations, rather than being broken down by transaction. And this created a space for women's rights organizations to use the funding based on their own priorities. And it reflects a broader shift. So moving from a compliance approach to accountability to a learning and trust-based approach to accountability. The second reflection that I thought would be useful is thinking about how we work differently as INGOs ourselves. The fund was implemented in partnership with ActionAid, but it wasn't about us being about parallel actors, but something that we did where we worked together towards shared outcomes around joint decision making, and a commitment to collaboration over over competition. And this, I think it matters, this finding and this reflection matters because the humanitarian system can often incentivize competition for funding, for visibility, for control between actors. But I think that what we saw is that the collaboration between us allowed us to pool our strengths, to reduce duplication, and it created a more coherent approach to supporting women's rights organizations. And in the paper, in the Pathways paper, it talks about the need for complementary funding ecosystems where actors work together rather than in silos. And our reflections from this process really echo that. The third reflection, and probably the most important one, is that we really had to challenge our own internal systems and our assumptions. And I'll provide a couple of examples. So, due diligence. When we did the due diligence to onboard women's rights organizations, we shifted away from a compliance-focused due diligence process to a lighter partnership-based approach. So due diligence became a way to build trust and to develop the relationship within that partnership. It was a moment to understand each other's organizations and to identify how the partnership could strengthen both sides, where there could be mutual benefit for each of the organizations in the partnership. So with Oxfam and the Women's Rights Organization. Another example is rethinking how we did reporting. When we were designing the reporting mechanism for women's rights organizations, we asked ourselves a very simple question, but one that doesn't, I think, gets asked very often, is why are we asking for this information? And I think that asking that simple question led us to remove reporting requirements that weren't useful, that were just going to sit in a folder somewhere, to focus on what really added value, and to co-create that learning process with women's rights organizations themselves. And we did similar to what Irene said that she's planning, we did a joint learning workshop with women's rights organizations where we talked about the outcomes and the impact that had been had through this approach. And we used that to co-develop a report and share ownership of how the outcomes were defined. And I think importantly, this is really critical, is that this didn't mean abandoning standards. We still upheld fundamental principles around safeguarding, around do no harm, around the humanitarian principles, because we're working in a crisis context. But we applied them in a different way that was proportionate, that was context driven, that was not extractive. So finally, I think we've been reflecting on what this approach made possible. And yes, it supported the immediate life-saving activities that women's rights organizations are doing with communities in Ukraine, especially marginalized communities in Ukraine. But its real value was also structural. So it enabled women's rights organizations to sustain their organizations, to continue their broader work on gender equality, and to strengthen that civil society during the war, during crisis. And this matters because women's rights organizations are not only humanitarian service providers, they're also part of the social infrastructure that communities rely on to survive, to recover, to rebuild at all phases of the crisis. So, I think that it was a different way of thinking about what we are looking for in terms of outcomes. It's not only immediate impact, but there are structural outcomes as well. I think I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. I feel like we couldn't have arranged our progression of speakers better to kind of set the stage and build towards this point, because you've rounded us off really nicely by, first of all, naming the political stakes around the big picture issues we're facing about the global gag rule and cuts and increasing crises. And that piece about the structural component is so key because, yes, funding women-led organizations is the right thing to do and the smart thing to do. But flexible funding also has the potential to give women-led organizations just space to breathe, zoom out and think longer term about the impact they want to achieve in their communities, whether it's through crisis response and through their wider work. And I think your comments about the willingness to change also puts us in a good position for the next session or section of our agenda, because Oxfam has power in this space, and seizing the opportunity to challenge internal assumptions and ways of working. Yeah, it sets the stage for what we're going to hear about next. So we've heard from our panel of lightning speakers. And now we're going to look at a few of the findings from our work, from the paper we're launching today. And I'm going to pass the mic to Dr. Katerina Matsili, my colleague, a senior research officer with the Humanitarian Policy Group and a key player in the team that produced this research. And she's going to walk us through some overarching findings of the work, building on what you've just heard and drawing together some threads from that work. Over to you, Katerina.
Thanks, Megan. I want to start by thanking all the speakers for sharing their interesting insights on their work and their experience with us. So now I'm going to draw some of the key points together, relying on the research results from our study on women-led organizations in crisis response. So here we go. Okay, so the stories we've just heard today demonstrate that only through adaptive and responsible approaches to funding women-led organizations, as other local organizations, it is possible to achieve transformative change. At the same time, it's also essential to recognize the diversity of women-led organizations, the diversity of their role, and what they need to work effectively. A lot has been done, but much more remains to be done in order to transform good practice into lasting change. So now I'm going to dive into 3 key points that have emerged from our research results. The first point I want to touch upon is that a variety of funding and different funding modalities exist in the humanitarian sector. Each of them has its own strengths, complementarity with other funding modalities, but only through the use of a variety of funding, it is possible to reach a balanced ecosystem. And similarly, women-led organizations are all different, not only because of their focus, their composition, the challenges they face, the communities they serve and they are connected to, but also the same organization might have different needs at different stages of their work, according to how their challenges change, but also according to other factors, such as, for example, the organizational development stage. And the research we conducted highlighted the need for increased coordination between women-led organizations and funders, and the possibility for women-led organizations to more freely move between different funding modalities according to the needs. But in order to reach that stage, 2 preconditions need to be achieved. The first one is a sufficient amount of funding, and a type of funding that also includes provisions for overheads, the security of staff, and funding for organizational development. Only through paying attention to these different points, funding can be really inclusive. And like Megan just said, funding has to be flexible and long-term to give organizations the possibility to develop, to tackle challenges that are long-lasting in many cases. Another important point that our research identified is that there is a catch-22 between visibility and access. And Irene gave us a very clear example of this, talking about FHN and CPAD. So the more an organization is visible, the more access to funding and decision-making spaces they have, and vice versa. But this creates a power imbalance, and perhaps even more importantly, this doesn't allow organizations potential to be fulfilled. So it is essential then to foster spaces for direct dialogue between funders and women-led organizations. And these spaces can take up a variety of modalities. They can be spaces for engagement, co-design, consultation, or inclusion in decision-making procedures. Although all of them should establish accountability mechanisms to really work effectively. And another point another narrative that emerged quite clearly from our research is that there is a shared perception in the humanitarian sector that the humanitarian system cannot be changed. It's immobile, it's immutable. However, at the same time, our research also revealed that each actor in the humanitarian system has their own leverage. And because of that, it is important to identify what unique leverage each actor has and to use it in order to open up spaces and points of entries. And then finally, I want to make a point on constraints. Another interesting result that emerged from our study is that some constraints in terms of perhaps funding and reporting requirement, diligence, are actual obstacles and requirements that exist and cannot be changed, and especially in relation to legal requirements. But in many cases, what is perceived as a constraint is nothing more than the result of practice and assumptions on procedures that have always been carried on in the same way. And because of this, it is important to identify what possibilities are there for increased flexibility. And Sarah gave us an excellent example about how to spot spaces for flexibility. This can help to identify spaces for pilots, for small projects that are key to generate the evidence base that funders need and the confidence to then scale up new and transformative processes. So I'm going to stop here and give the floor to Megan.
Thank you, Katerina. So we've pulled together these different strands from what we've heard today from our speakers and from what we found over the course of our research. And it's clear that change is not just a question of efficiency or effectiveness within the current system. It's a question of shifting paradigms around what humanitarian response is, who carries it out, and what it's seeking to achieve. And this is very much aligned with calls to transform power structures within the sector and to localize, when I put that in quotations deliberately. I'm going to walk us through these 6 paradigm shifts that we include in the paper quickly, and then we'll open it up to discussion. But the first of our paradigm shifts is openness to new ways of working. And I think a few of our speakers covered this really well about what's possible when we innovate and when we try something new. Because the challenges facing humanitarian action are immense right now. We can't deny that. And that should lead to greater willingness to innovate. But in a lot of cases, we're seeing the opposite. We're seeing humanitarians retreating to what they know. But that was never working. And the reasons to change are much more than just funding cuts. Our second paradigm is local impact over donor priorities. And on a panel last week at Humanitarian Networks and Partnerships Week, we said exactly this. Start from who you want to reach. and fund accordingly. Don't be surprised when mechanisms that were never designed to reach marginalized groups don't reach them. We need to start working from the impact we want to have and not from what's convenient to funders. Thirdly, flipping the script on risk. And we've heard risk mentioned here and there by our different speakers today. And it's usually used as a reason why not, why it's too hard, too scary to fund women-led organizations, to fund new innovative approaches of all kinds. But we need to consider a full picture when it comes to risk. That there's risks of every approach we choose to take. There's risks of not funding women-led organizations. There's risks to women leaders themselves that are usually not accounted for in our models in the system. And there's the risks to the sustainability of women's rights movements. We heard so much from Ahyla and from Irene about that work, and that it is so much more than crisis response. And I know the Feminist Humanitarian Network is about to launch some really great work on risk, so watch for that. Recentering affected people. And I want to add here, recentering affected people and the actors that are already reaching them. One of our colleagues in HPG likes to say, humanitarians like to lead at what they do. And that's a problem. We're not asking funders or agencies to create locally led alternatives. We're asking them to support what's already there and already happening, or at least to ensure they're not undermining that work. It's not about reinventing the wheel. It's about working in a more joined up, efficient, and coordinated way. Our second last paradigm is valuing process over outputs. In the humanitarian sector, we're used to talking about reach, that you need to reach as many people as you can. But that leaves aside questions about quality. And this is really about how the how is as important as the what here, how we go about doing the work, what our partnerships look like, what those working relationships look like. Working with women-led organizations to design collaborative, community-centered, and sustainable interventions leads to better quality outcomes. And that's sort of the paradox that when we focus on process, we also get better outputs. But finally, and the note I want to leave you on is courage, which is simple but true. As Katerina was saying, this is about resisting the set narratives in the system, the stories we tell ourselves about what's possible and what's not, the assumptions we have about what will work and what won't. And many times those narratives don't stack up against the evidence, and they certainly don't stack up against ideas about accessibility, autonomy, and local leadership. Katerina, if you could switch to the next slide, please. So please do check out the new paper, as well as the two papers that came before it. There, you can see them there on screen. Read them, share them, pass them on. It's more important than ever, given it what everyone has had to say today, to shift the dial on supporting effective, accessible, and inclusive women-led humanitarian responses. And we've been privileged to play a small role in amplifying the voices of women-led organizations themselves over the course of this project, and to work on building connections. I hope it's not the last you'll hear from us on this. But now we'd love to hear from all of you. I think we have all of our speakers here for the Q&A, and we're also joined by Olivia Golden from UKF CDO, because I think Rurik has been pulled away to other commitments. You can see in the chat, Nick has pointed us to the Q&A box. So if you have any questions, please put them there. But also our speakers, feel free if you have questions for one another or reflections coming out of what everyone's had to say. The floor is open, and we'd love to hear from you. You've heard enough from me. Ohyla, please go ahead.
Thank you. I want to thank you for the paper. It's really reflect what I mean, what we face in our daily life dealing with fund and with donor. And sometimes it's take from us a lot of energy, a lot of time, and in that time we can help more people. And if I want to compare on the effort that we put. But I want to mention something important. I mean, you just raised this on the paper. For instance, today we are in a very difficult crisis, I think, in the world in terms of funding, not only in Palestine. It's a global problem, but I mean, in specific communities, it's more difficult because the opportunities is less and the competition is very high.
Mm.
So I want to give a recommendation also for donors. Like, for instance, I will share experience that during the COVID, closure, we as a helpline, we did, from the first day of the lock off, we continue our work because we work remotely. And our helpline built to operate from any place in the world, for instance. So when we apply for donors, they support more than 100 of helplines, new one. So they didn't focus on the experienced one. They start to support and to build the new helplines for, and they don't have any trust with the community. And after the fund is finished, they are closed. So it's very important when donor want to support a service to make mapping about services and try to support the experienced one and to give them the sustainability to continue, because sometimes when they start to support new initiative related to services or exist, there's no place to make the comparison because we have experience and others are new, but we are willing to help if they want to establish something, can complete our work or service that needed. So this is my recommendation. Thank you.
Thank you, Ohila. I think you get at kind of the core of this about collaborating with the networks and the movements that are already in place. And that's true for so many women-led organizations. As Sarah was saying, they exist before crises as women's rights organizations and movements. And that means they have roots, they have proximity and knowledge that other actors coming in response to crisis just can't match. And I think that's so key. And it's a question of efficiency. It's a question of using resources well, to not duplicate, to not undermine what's already there and is already working. Irene, would you like to come in?
Yes. I wanted to comment on my observation in engaging in these platforms recently. I have observed that there has been a lot of discussions about countries that are in crisis, and of course, it's important that those countries are discussed and the focus on them must not be lost because they need us. But I was wondering what the world is thinking about Bangladesh and Uganda, the biggest countries, like the two countries where we have the largest number of refugees existing. I did not hear any conversations about these countries. As the women-led organizations in these countries, we are beginning to feel like we are in the forgotten conflicts again, because we still have these refugees in our communities. We are seeing them every day. And for me, as a person, some of our partners are refugee-led organizations. And every time I go to the settlement and they see the vehicle with Feminist Humanitarian Network, and they think that I'm bringing additional resources, but I only have resource from one donor, which is probably expiring at the end of this year. It's been 2 years funding. Of course, discussions are going on to expand that, but still the resources are not enough to meet the needs of the people we serve. I am just wondering if there is any platform where there are conversations on prioritizing these countries that are still hosting the largest number of refugees, because that's another crisis that I think the world still need to think, because as long as these refugee producing countries are not yet stable, you should know that the countries receiving the refugees are unstable, because this is just going to be continuous cycle of violence. And if we don't support these refugees, it's going to start causing problems in the hosting countries. So I really am wondering at this point in time, where are these conversations happening? Because I feel like I'm missing that platform where those conversations are taking place. Thank you. Over to you.
Yeah, you make a really, really important point there. And I think, we've been talking about the mechanisms that are built to do this work. And I think that also calls attention to frankly some of the big ones in the humanitarian space that are being pointed to as solutions for getting more money out to local organizations, but that aren't the best equipped for settings with large refugee populations, for settings that are receiving less attention than others, and the need to think differently. If we're not reaching the people we want to reach through the mechanisms we have, then we need to rethink. We have a couple questions in the chat that I'm going to share as well, and then invite others to jump in on whichever of these points we want to. The first is from Sarah, who asks how to get involved. How can we sign up to be a member? Well, I wish we could say there was a singular movement to join here, but if you mean the Feminist Humanitarian Network, then you can look at the link that we shared. There's a few members of FHN here on the call, and we'd love to have more members join, either as an organization if you're from a women-led organization, or as an individual if you represent an international NGO or another kind of actor. Maybe if you're based in Uganda, you may mean the national platform, in which case Irene is the one who can wade in on that. And we have another question from Alan, who's asking about Afghanistan and the restrictive policy environment for women, and how donors can realistically fund and engage women-led organizations without exposing them to additional risk or shutdown. And so I'm wondering well, I'm looking at Vanita first for that question, but there might be an opportunity there to think more broadly about risk to women leaders and the ways that funders can better recognize and support mitigating those risks. And so, Vanita, I'm again looking to you and hoping you might be
Sure.
able to start us off on that one. But others, feel free to raise your hands and come in after.
Yeah, I was typing the response as you pointed at me, so let me respond live. I think what I was typing is that there are a few ways. I think the first thing is to be in consultation directly with Afghan women activists and defenders who continue to mobilize, who continue to support both inside Afghanistan and outside. There are a host of steps and new actually infrastructure that has emerged post 2021 that helps the urgent action funds for sure move money into Afghanistan without placing the burden of risk and receiving that money upon women defenders themselves who continue to live in Afghanistan. So that's the first thing, is to consult with Afghan defenders themselves. The second is that I think, like Irene mentioned, there are a few countries that are continuing to be in a state of complete shutdown. So Myanmar and Afghanistan are both squarely they fall into that category for us in our region. For both of those organizations, for both of those countries, it is true that a whole host of diasporic organizations have emerged. So in Afghanistan, especially after 2021, there is a host of Afghan-led groups, organizations, even financial mechanisms that fall beyond, formal financial institutions that have emerged that are doing this work that we rely on. And there is an absolute need to support diasporic organizations and diasporic organizing, even if it's outside formal institutions. In the case of Myanmar earthquake, they were the first ones to put out there about 300 organizations, most of whom were outside Myanmar, had put together a statement, mobilized dollars, moved money, because even Myanmar, like Afghanistan, is very restrictive environment. And finally, I think regional funds so organizations that are not necessarily registered inside the country where there is high risk. So this includes diasporic organizations, but also regional entities and regional funds such as ourselves. Then there's a whole host of first response fund members, one of which is us, but there are several others who continue to respond to Afghanistan. And that's another way to move money. Several institutions, including bilats that have supported us for Afghanistan work, and private foundations, think of this also as a route for them to mitigate their own risk profile. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Irene, do you want to come in?
Yes, Megan, I think that's an excellent question. I can only answer it from my experience that those women-led women's rights organizations could be there, but are they known to everybody? You know, the question I spoke about last week, like who knows you? You might have all these networks, these funders or where, but do they know you as, as a small women-led organization? Because that's one risk we face, by the way. No one knows us. And so we're there sitting and thinking that we're going to write proposals, and then at the end of the day, the answer to your proposal is, oh, we actually really don't know you. So can we give space for those little small women-led organizations in Afghanistan also? If they can manage to come out of the country, can they actually also be in these platforms and talk for themselves and ask for themselves what they want, not somebody else doing that? Because somebody needs to know them by name and see their faces, how they look like. That's actually one way you're going to actually manage those risks, because people listen to you, people see you, people get to understand you. And for me, that paves another way of trying to manage some of this risk. You can have thousands of, how many platforms do we have in Uganda? I didn't even know how many now.
Once again, just as she was getting into a real flow there, that's a shame. Hopefully she'll be back shortly. In the meantime, does anyone else want to jump in on risk? Oh, Irene, you're back. Are you there?
I'm here. I think my internet is like, you are done for today, you can't proceed.
Yes. You're burning up
Yes.
the airwaves, so.
Yes. So I will stop there for now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So we've got a few topics on the table around the risks to women leaders, around how to better reach sort of forgotten crises, and including some of the biggest ones. Does anyone else want to jump in? I mean, I think the risks to women leaders came across to me really strongly in the course of the research we were doing. It's something we don't talk about enough, and that is often excluded in funding models from what are allowable costs. And that, along with the overload of the work we ask of women leaders to in terms of how funding models work, is just such an unseen cost against them as individuals. Sarah, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I think on that point, that's something that was coming through very, very strongly in Ukraine, that women's rights organizations who often rely on volunteers, who often do the core of their work outside the projects that they're funded to do. So in their kind of I was talking to one organization that were talking about their advocacy work on gender equality as a hobby that they do in the evenings. It's not a hobby that they do in the evenings, but they don't have the time in the day to do that work as well. So I think that the burnout issue is and the challenges that individual women and women leaders face in when they're responding is something that's not recognized enough. And actually a number of the women's rights organizations that we have used have used part of the funds to invest in their staff in terms of their well-being, in terms of having a kind of moment for reflection and a bit of a step back from the work that they're doing, which is not only really critical for their own well-being and their mental health, but is also really important for the organization in order to be able to step back and have a reflection moment, which there's just not time to do normally. And it's because, as you say, Megan, that's not often eligible in regular funding. We need to be finding ways in which we're providing women's rights opportunities and the people that work there the opportunity to have these things. It's really important.
Yeah, that's reminding me, we were in so many sessions last week at Humanitarian Networks and Partnerships Week, and there were a number of Ukrainian women-led organizations there, and it was Olya, I think, from Feminist Workshop, who talked about, she said, told us this harrowing story saying, I buried part of my family and I worked in the car on the way back from the cemetery because I have an organization to run and a proposal was due. And I think that toll on women leaders. And you mentioned in your remarks, Sarah, about the distinction between a women's rights organization and a women-led organization. And, one of them's about what they work on, that they work on women's rights and gender justice, and one of them is about who's doing the work. But in both cases, they face sexism and misogyny in their communities that expose them to risk for doing the work, on top of the risks of related to conflict, crisis, displacement. And that's not something that is always visible in the work we do, or the way that we as an international sector support them. And Irene, as you've mentioned, that funding often doesn't cover things like insurance or maternity leave or the kinds of things we need to do frankly feminist work in this space. Any further questions or interventions anyone wants to make? Olivia, please.
Thanks. And this has been absolutely fascinating to listen to and really brought the paper alive. So thank you for the very lively discussion. And I just wanted to bring out risks that, Irene, you talked about last week as well, in terms of standing up for the rights of women and marginalised people where government doesn't always agree with some of those rights, and the risk that puts women leaders in, including yourself, Irene, that you talked about. And we have a role as donors, as diplomatic partners in that as well. So really open to hearing from WLOs and WROs how you think we can work together on that, and working with our embassies on rights. Thanks.
Thank you. Well, we're coming towards time, so I think I'm going to take a moment and try to summarize everything that's come out today, which, I don't think I'm equal to the task. But like I said, I hope that this is far from the last time that we'll be able to come together and discuss these kinds of questions. It's more important than ever to keep the conversation going and to keep these issues visible and on the table as we progress with the various humanitarian reform agendas and discussions that are going on. humanitarian action, as we said from the outset, is confronted with so many challenges right now. It has been for 10 years already, but in the last year, that's accelerated so much. Not just with funding cuts, but with the sorts of explicit ideological challenges that we're seeing to gender justice, to inclusion and diversity, and to international assistance as an agenda. And so the thoughts I want to leave you with, first of all, is that this is a question of quality. I mentioned Gloria Doñate's remark, is this about innovation or is this about just doing good work? And this is a question of good work. This is about quality, that working with women-led organizations, resourcing them to do the work they're best positioned to do means better responses. And secondly, that even when funding isn't forthcoming, we're in difficult times and there isn't always money, but even when funding is not forthcoming, that doesn't mean the door needs to close on conversations. That access to spaces, to decision making, to networks, is as important. And those are relationships we can keep building no matter what. That it's important we don't let our relationships be reduced to funding, because that doesn't help us get away from power dynamics and from hierarchical relationships at all. So thank you to everyone for joining us today, to our speakers for taking the time and sharing their expertise, to my co-authors, Nick and Katerina, for being here on the call and sharing the work that we've done over the last year, and the Feminist Humanitarian Network for partnering with us at so many stages of this, and so many other members are here today. And please do check out the paper, share it, and keep talking about women-led organizations and women-led action. Thanks, everybody.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.